Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche, Part 8, Peoples and Fatherlands. I heard it again for the first time. Richard Wagner's overture to Meistersinger. It is magnificent, ornate, heavy, late art that takes pride in presupposing 200 years of music as still living in order to be comprehensible. It is a credit to the Germans that this sort of pride is not mistaken. What strengths and life forces, what seasons and territories are not combined here? One moment, the work will strike us as old-fashioned, and the next as alien, harsh, and overly young. It is just as capricious as it is pompously conventional. It is not infrequently mischievous, and more often coarse and uncouth. It has fire and courage, and at the same time, the loose, drab skin of fruit that ripens too late. It flows in a full and expansive manner, and then suddenly a moment of inexplicable hesitation, like a gap that springs up between cause and effect. A dream-inducing pressure, practically a nightmare. But even then, the old stream of contentment spreads far and wide once again. That stream of the most varied contentment, of old fortunes and new, which very much include the artist's happiness with himself, a happiness he does not want to hide, his astonished, joyful part in knowing he has mastered the devices he employs here. Newly acquired, untried artistic devices, as he seems to reveal to us. All told, no beauty, nothing of the South, none of the fine, southern, brilliant skies, no gracefulness or dance, barely a will to logic, a certain awkwardness, in fact, which is even emphasized as if the artist wanted to tell us, I meant to do that. An unwieldy guise, something capriciously barbaric and solemn, a flurry of erudite and venerable delicacies and lace, something German in the best and the worst senses of the word, something multiple, informal, and inexhaustible in a German way, a certain German powerfulness and over fullness of the soul that is not afraid to hide behind the refinements of decline. And perhaps this is where it feels best, a fair and fitting emblem of the German soul that is simultaneously young and obsolete, overdone and still overflowing with future. This type of music best expresses what I think about the Germans. They are from the day before yesterday and the day after tomorrow. They still have no today. We good Europeans, even we have hours when we allow ourselves a robust fatherlandishness, a slip and backslide into old loves and confines. I have just given a sample of this. Hours of national outbursts, patriotic trepidations, and all sorts of other antiquated floods of affect. But things that run their course in us in a matter of hours might take clumsier spirits longer periods of time to get over. A good half a year in some cases and half a lifetime in others, according to the speed and strength of their digestion and metabolism. In fact, I could imagine dull and hesitant races who would need half a century, even in our speedy Europe, to overcome such atavistic fits of fatherlandishness, to unglue themselves from the soil and return to reason, by which I mean good Europeanism. And while digressing on this possibility, it so happens that I'm becoming an ear witness to a conversation between two old patriots, both obviously hard of hearing, and so speaking that much louder. He thinks and knows as much about philosophy as a peasant or a fraternity student, said the one. He's still innocent, but who cares these days? This is the age of the masses. They lie prostrate in front of anything massive. And the same in politics, too. They call a statesman great if he builds them a new Tower of Babel or some sort of monstrosity of empire and power. Who cares if we are more cautious and circumspect and keep holding on to our old belief that it takes a great thought to make a cause or action great? Suppose that a statesman puts his people in the position of needing to do great politics in the future. although they are ill-equipped and ill-prepared by nature for this task, so that they need to sacrifice their old and reliable virtues for the sake of a new and dubious mediocrity. Suppose that such a statesman condemns his people to any political activity at all, when in fact they have had better things to do and to think about until now, and at the bottom of their souls they hadn't got rid of a cautious disgust at the agitation, emptiness, and riotous brawling of truly politicized peoples. Suppose that a statesman like this incites the dormant passions and greed of his people, makes a flaw out of their former shyness and the way they enjoyed staying to the side, makes a fault out of their cosmopolitanism and secret infinity, devalues their most heartfelt tendencies, turns their conscience around, makes their spirit narrow and their taste national. What? A statesman who would do all that, whose people would have to serve him like a prison sentence for all the future, if they even had a future. This sort of a statesman is great, without a doubt, answered the old patriot vehemently. Otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do it. Perhaps it was crazy to want something like this, but perhaps everything great started out as simply crazy. That's an abuse of language, shouted the first speaker in reply. Strong, 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 and crazy, not great. The old men had grown visibly heated as they yelled their truths into each other's faces like this. But me, in my happiness and my beyond, I considered how soon the strong come to be dominated by the stronger, and also that the spiritual leveling of one people is compensated for in the deepening of another. Whatever term is used these days to try to mark what is distinctive about the European, whether it is civilization or humanization or progress, or rather, without implying praise or censure, it is simply labeled Europe's democratic movement. Behind all the moral and political foregrounds that are indicated by formulas like these, an immense physiological process is taking place, and constantly gaining ground. The process of increasing similarity between Europeans, their growing detachment from the conditions under which climate or class-bound races originate, their increasing independence from that determinate milieu where for centuries the same demands would be inscribed on the soul and the body. And so the slow approach of an essentially supranational and nomadic type of person who, physiologically speaking, is typified by a maximal degree of the art and force of adaptation. This process of the European in a state of becoming can be slowed down in tempo through large-scale relapses. Although this might be the very thing that makes it gain and grow in vehemence and depth. The still raging storm and stress of national feeling belongs here, as does the anarchism that is only just approaching. This process will probably end up with results that its naive supporters and eulogists, the apostles of modern ideas, have least expected. The same new conditions that generally lead to a leveling and mediocritization of man. A useful, industrious, abundantly serviceable, and able herd animal man are to the highest degree suitable for giving rise to exceptional people who possess the most dangerous and attractive qualities. Considering the fact that every adaptive force which systematically tests an ever-changing set of conditions, starting over with each generation, practically with each decade, does not make the powerfulness of the type even remotely possible. Considering the fact that the overall impression of such future Europeans will probably be of exceedingly garrulous, impotent, and eminently employable workers who need masters and commanders like they need their daily bread. And finally, considering the fact that Europe's democratization amounts to the creation of a type prepared for slavery in the most subtle sense, taking all this into account, the strong person will need, in particular and exceptional cases, to get stronger and richer than he has perhaps ever been so far, thanks to a lack of prejudice in his schooling, thanks to an enormous diversity in practice, art, and masks. What I am trying to say is the democratization of Europe is at the same time an involuntary exercise in the breeding of tyrants. Understanding that word in every sense, including the most spiritual. I'm glad to hear that our sun is moving rapidly towards the constellation of Hercules, and I hope that the people of this earth will act like the sun, with us in front, we good Europeans. There was a time when it was customary to call the Germans profound as a term of distinction. Now that the most successful type of new Germanism desires a completely different sort of honor and has perhaps come to regret the absence of a certain elan in everything profound. It is almost timely and patriotic to ask whether people have not been fooling themselves with this praise. In short, whether German profundity is not something fundamentally different and worse, and something we are about to get rid of, thank God. So, to try to change our ideas about German profundity, all we need is a little vivisection of the German soul. More than anything else, the German soul is multiple. It originates in different places and is more piled up and pieced together than actually constructed. This is due to its origin. A German with the audacity to claim 2 souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, would be abusing the truth badly, or to be more accurate, would fall quite a few souls short of the truth. As a people composed of the most enormous assortment and combination of races, perhaps even with a preponderance of the pre-Aryan element, as a people of the middle in every sense, The Germans are more incomprehensible, comprehensive, contradictory, unfamiliar, unpredictable, surprising, and even frightening than other peoples are to themselves. They escape definition, which by itself makes them the despair of the French. It is characteristic of the Germans that the question, what is German, never dies out with them. Kotzebue certainly knew his Germans well enough. We are known, they called out to him in joy. But Sand claimed to know them too. Jean-Paul knew what he was doing when he came out furiously against Fitch, dishonest but patriotic flattery and exaggerations. But Goethe probably felt differently from Jean-Paul about the Germans. Even though he thought Jean-Paul was right about Fichte. What did Goethe really think about the Germans? But Goethe never did speak plainly about many of the things around him, and was an expert at subtle silence all his life. He probably had his reasons. It is clear that the wars of liberation did not raise his level of enthusiasm any more than the French Revolution had done. The event that made him rethink his Faust, and indeed the whole problem of man, was the appearance of Napoleon. There are sayings where Goethe speaks as if from abroad, disputing with impatient hardness just what Germans take pride in. He once defined the famous German Gemüt as tolerance towards others' weaknesses as well as your own. Was he wrong? It is characteristic of the Germans that people are rarely completely wrong about them. The German soul has passages going this way and that. It has caves, hiding places, and dungeons. Its disorder has much of the charm of the mysterious. The German is an expert on the secret paths to chaos. And just as everything loves its likeness, the German loves clouds and everything unclear, becoming nebulous, damp, and overcast. He feels that uncertainty, disorganization, displacement, and growth of every type are profound. the German himself is not. He becomes, he develops. Development, then, is the truly German discovery and sensation in the great realm of philosophical formulas. A governing concept that, in conjunction with German beer and German music, is working to Germanize all of Europe. Foreigners stand amazed and enthralled before the riddles posed to them by the contradictory nature at the base of the German soul, which Hegel brought into a system and Richard Wagner finally set to music. Good-natured and spiteful. A juxtaposition like this, which would be absurd in reference to any other people, is all too often justified in Germany. Unfortunately, just live with Swabians for a while. The ponderousness of German scholars, their social fatuousness is frighteningly consistent with an inner high-wire act and easy boldness in the face of which all gods have learned fear by now. If you want a demonstration of the German soul ad oculus, just look at German taste, German arts and customs. What a boorish indifference to taste. How the noblest stands right next to the most base. How disorderly and rich this whole psychic economy really is. The German lugs his soul around. He lugs around everything he experiences. He digests his events badly. He is never finished with them. German profundity is often just a weak and sluggish digestion. And just as everyone who is chronically ill, all dyspeptics, tends toward comfortable things, the Germans love openness and everything upright. How comfortable it is to be open and upright. Today, the Germans are expert at what is perhaps the happiest and most dangerous disguise. That trusting, accommodating, all cards on the table attitude of genuine German honesty. This is their truly Mephistophelian art. And with it they can still go far. The German lets himself go, looks out with true, blue, empty German eyes. And foreigners immediately mistake him for his nightshirt. What I am trying to say is, let German profundity be what it will. And just between us, perhaps, we will allow ourselves a laugh at its expense. We would do well to honor its appearance and good name in the future as well, and not to trade in our old reputation as people of profundity too cheaply for Prussian elan or Berliner wit and sand. It is clever of a people to pass themselves off, to let themselves pass for profound, undiplomatic, good-natured, honest, and unclever. It could even be profound. Finally, people should live up to their name. And it's not for nothing that the Germans, die Deutsch, are called the Teuch people, the Tausch, deceptive people. The good old days are over. They sang themselves out in Mozart. How lucky for us that his Rococo still speaks to us, that his good company, his tender enthusiasms, his childish pleasure in chinoiserie and fancy flourishes, his courtesy of the heart, his longing for the delicate and the amorous, for dancing and tearful moments of bliss. His faith in the South might still appeal to some vestige in us. Oh, someday all this will be gone. But who can doubt that the understanding and taste for Beethoven will be gone even sooner? Although he was only the final of a transitional style and stylistic discontinuity, and not, like Mozart, the finale of a centuries-old great European taste. Beethoven falls somewhere between a brittle old soul that is constantly coming apart and an overly young, future-oriented soul that is constantly on its way. A dusk of eternal loss and eternal wild hope lies over his music. The same light that lay across Europe when it dreamed with Rousseau danced around the freedom tree of the Revolution and ended up practically worshiping Napoleon. But how quickly this very feeling is now fading. How difficult it is to even know about this feeling these days. How foreign the language of this Rousseau, Schiller, Shelley, and Byron sounds to our ear. These men in whom, collectively, the same European destiny, which in Beethoven knew how to sing, found its way into words. What became of German music afterwards belongs in Romanticism, which is to say, in a movement that was calculated historically. Even briefer, more fleeting, and more superficial than that great entr'acte, that European transition from Rousseau to Napoleon and the rise of democracy. Weber, but what are Freischütz and Oberon to us these days? Or Marschner's Hans Heiling and Vampire? Or even Wagner's Tannhauser? This music is gone, if not yet forgotten. At any rate, the whole music of Romanticism was not noble enough, not music enough to have rights anywhere except in the theater and in front of crowds. It was second-rate music from the very start, and real musicians took little notice of it. Things were different with Felix Mendelssohn, the halcyon master who, thanks to his easier, purer, happier soul, was quickly honored and just as quickly forgotten as a lovely incident in German music. But when it comes to Robert Schumann, who took things seriously and was from the start taken seriously himself, he is the last to have founded a school. Don't we think of it today as a stroke of bad luck? A relief, a liberation that just this Schumannian romanticism has been overcome? Schumann, fleeing into the Saxon Switzerland of his soul, half Wertherish, half Jean Pauline by nature, certainly not Beethoven-esque, certainly not Byronic. His Manfred music is a mistake and a misunderstanding to the point of injustice. Schumann, with his taste, which was fundamentally a small taste, being a dangerous tendency towards calm lyricism and a drunkenness of feeling, which is twice as dangerous among Germans, going constantly to the side, timidly excusing himself and retreating, a noble, tender creature who reveled in nothing but anonymous happiness and pain. A type of little girl in Noli Me Tangere from the start. This Schumann was already a merely German event in music, no longer a European event like Beethoven, or to a still more comprehensive extent like Mozart. With Schumann, German music was threatened with its greatest danger, that of losing the voice of the European soul and descending to a mere fatherlandishness. What torture German books are for anyone with a third ear. How how reluctantly he stands by the slowly revolving quagmire of toneless tones and rhythms without dance that the Germans call a book. In the Germans who read books, how lazily, how grudgingly, how badly they read. How many Germans know and require themselves to know that there is an art in every good sentence. Art that wants to be discerned to the extent that the sentence wants to be understood. A misunderstanding about its tempo, for instance, and the sentence itself is misunderstood. To have no doubts as to the rhythmically decisive syllables. To feel breaks in the most stringent of symmetries as deliberate and attractive. To extend a subtle and patient ear to every staccato and every rubato, guessing the meaning of the order of vowels and diphthongs, and how tenderly and richly they can change color and change it again when put next to each other. Who among book-reading Germans is well-meaning enough to acknowledge duties and demands like these, and to listen for so much art and intent in language? In the end, people just do not have the ear for it. And so the strongest contrasts in style go unheard, and the most subtle artistry is wasted as if on the deaf. These were my thoughts as I noticed two masters in the art of prose being crudely and thoughtlessly mistaken for each other. The one whose words drip down with coldness and hesitation, as if from the roof of a damp cave. He counts on their dull sound and resonance. And another who handles his language like a supple rapier, and from his fingers to his toes feels the dangerous joy of the quivering, over-sharpened sword that wants to bite, sizzle, cut. How little the German style has to do with tones and with ears is shown by the fact that it is precisely our good musicians who write poorly. Germans do not read aloud. They do not read for the ear, but only with the eye, keeping their ears in a jar in the meantime. When ancient people read, if they read at all, it happened seldom enough. It was aloud to themselves, and moreover in a loud voice. People were surprised by someone reading quietly and secretly wondering why. In a loud voice, that means with all the swells, inflections, sudden changes in tone, and shifts in tempo that the ancient public world took pleasure in. At that time, the rules for written style were the same as those for spoken style. And those rules depended in part on the astonishing development and subtle requirements of the ear and larynx. And also, in part, on the strength, endurance, and power of the ancient lung. What the ancients meant by a period is primarily a physiological unit, insofar as it is combined in a single breath. Periods like the ones that occur in Demosthenes and Cicero, swelling up twice and twice sinking down, and all within a single breath. Those were a delight for people of antiquity, who knew from their own training to value the virtue of the rarity and difficulty involved in performing periods like these. We have no real right to the great period, we who are modern, we who are short-winded in every sense. On the whole, these ancients were themselves dilettantes in rhetoric, and therefore authorities, and consequently critics. This is how they drove their rhetoricians to extremes. Similarly, in the previous century, when all the men and women of Italy knew how to sing, virtuosity in song, and with it the art of melody too, reached a high point. But in Germany there was, until very recently, when a sort of grandstand verbosity shyly and awkwardly stirred in its young wings. Really only one species of public and vaguely artistic rhetoric, and that came from the pulpit. In Germany, only the preachers knew the weight of a word or syllable, the extent to which a sentence stumbled, sprang, rang, ran, or ran away. They were the only ones with a conscience in their ears, which was often enough an evil conscience, because there was no shortage of reasons why a German of all people should achieve competence in rhetoric infrequently and almost always too late. This is why the masterpiece of German prose is by all rights the masterpiece of its greatest preacher. The Bible has been the best German book to date. Compared to Luther's Bible, almost everything else is merely literature, something that had not grown in Germany, and for that reason did not grow, and is not growing into German hearts like the Bible did. There are two types of genius. One that fundamentally begets and wants to beget, and another that is happy to be impregnated and give birth. Similarly, with peoples of genius, there are those who inherit the female problem of pregnancy and the secret task of forming, ripening, and bringing to completion. The Greeks, for instance, were this type of people, as well as the French, and others who need to impregnate and be the cause of new orders of life, like the Jews, the Romans, and to pose a modest question, the Germans? Peoples tortured and delighted by unknown fevers, who irresistibly leave themselves, loving and lusting after foreign races, after ones who let themselves be impregnated, and also domineering, like everything that knows itself to be full of creative forces, and consequently knows of God's grace. These two types of genius look for each other like men and women, but they are also misunderstood each other like men and women. Every people has its own tartufferies and calls them virtues. You do not know. You cannot know what is best about yourself. What Europe owes to the Jews? Many things both good and bad, but mainly one thing that is both best and worst. The grand style in morality, the horror and majesty of infinite demands, infinite meanings, the whole romanticism and sublimity of the morally questionable, and consequently, precisely the most appealing, insidious, and exceptional aspect of those plays of colors and seductions to life in whose afterglow the sky of our present European culture, even its evening sky, glows away. Perhaps goes away. This is why, among the spectators and philosophers, artists like us regard the Jews with gratitude. We have to accept the fact that all sorts of clouds and disturbances, basically small fits of stupefaction, drift over the spirit of a people who suffers and wants to suffer from national nervous fevers and political ambition. With today's Germans, for instance, there is the anti-French stupidity one moment, and the anti-Jewish stupidity the next. Now the anti-Polish stupidity. Now the Christian romantic, the Wagnerian, the Teutonic, the Prussian. Just look at these poor historians, these sibyls and trichics with their thickly bandaged heads, or whatever else they might be called. These little stupors of the German spirit and conscience. Please forgive the fact that during a short and risky stay in a badly infected region, I did not completely escape this illness either. And like everyone else, started worrying about things that were none of my business. The first sign of political infection. About the Jews, for instance. Just listen. I have yet to meet a German who was well disposed towards Jews. And however unconditional the rejection of genuine anti-Semitism might be on the part of every prudent or political person. Such prudence in politics are not really aimed at anti-Semitic sentiment in general, but instead at its dangerous excess, and especially at the outrageous and disgraceful expression of this excessive sentiment. This cannot be denied. That Germany has ample quantities of Jews. That the German stomach and the German blood have difficulty and will continue for a long time to have difficulty coping with even this number of Jews, as the Italians, the French, the British have coped, due to a stronger digestion. This is the clear statement and language of a universal instinct that needs to be listened to and acted on. Don't let in any more Jews, and lock the doors to the East in particular, even to Austria. So commands the instinct of a people whose type is still weak and indeterminate enough to blur easily and be easily obliterated by a stronger race. But the Jews are without a doubt the strongest, purest, most tenacious race living in Europe today. They know how to thrive, even in the worst conditions, and actually do better than in favorable ones, due to some virtues that people today would like to see labeled as vices. Above all, thanks to a resolute faith that does not need to feel ashamed in the face of modern ideas, makes its conquests, being an empire that has time and was not made yesterday, namely, according to the fundamental principle, as slowly as possible. A thinker who has Europe's future on his conscience will, in every sketch he draws of his future, consider the Jews, like the Russians, to be the most certain and probable factors at present in the great play and struggle of forces. What gets called a nation in Europe today, and is really more a re facta than a nata, every once in a while a re ficta, a picta, will look exactly the same, is, in any case, something young, easily changed, and in a state of becoming, not yet a race, let alone the sort of air perennius that the Jewish type is. These nations should be on a careful lookout for any hot-headed rivalry and hostility. The fact that the Jews, if they wanted, or if they were forced, as the anti-Semites seem to want, could already be dominant, or indeed could quite literally have control over present-day Europe, this is established. The fact that they are not working and making plans to this end is likewise established. Meanwhile, what they wish and want instead, with a unified assertiveness even, is to be absorbed and assimilated into Europe. They thirst for some place where they can be settled, permitted, respected at last, and where they can put an end to the nomadic life the wandering Jew. And this urge and impulse, which in itself perhaps already reveals a slackening of the Jewish instincts, should be carefully noted and accommodated, in which case it might be practical and appropriate to throw the anti-Semitic hooligans out of the country. Approached selectively and with all due caution, the way it is done by the English nobility, it would clearly be unproblematic for the stronger and more strongly delineated types of New Germanism. The officers of noble rank from the mark, for instance, to get involved with them, and it would be very interesting to see whether the genius of fortune and fortitude, and above all some spirit and spiritedness, which are in very short supply in the place just mentioned, could not be added into, bred into, the hereditary art of commanding and obeying, both of which are classic features of the mark these days. But I should really break off my cheerful speeches and hyper-Germania here, since I am already touching on something I take seriously, on the European problem as I understand it. To rule Europe. This is not a philosophical race, these Englishmen. Bacon signified an attack on the philosophical spirit in general. Hobbes, Hume, and Locke indicated a degradation and depreciation in value of the concept philosopher for more than a century. Kant rose up and rebelled against Hume, and it was Locke about whom Schelling was able to say, "Je méprise Locke." Hegel and Schopenhauer were of one mind, along with Goethe, in the struggle against the English mechanistic world stupidification. Those two hostile brother geniuses in philosophy, who divided along the opposing poles of the German spirit and, in the process, wronged each other as only brothers can. That fatuous dolt, Carlyle, knew well enough what England lacks and has always lacked. Carlyle, that half-actor and rhetorician who tried to conceal under impassioned grimaces what he knew about himself, namely, what he lacked: real power of intellect, real profundity of spiritual vision. In short, philosophy. It is characteristic of an unphilosophical race like this to firmly support Christianity. They need its discipline to be moralized and in some sense humanized. It is just because the English are gloomier, stronger-willed, more sensuous, and more brutal than the Germans that they, as the baser of the two, are the more pious as well. they need Christianity that much more. To subtler nostrils, even this English Christianity bears the genuinely English odor of the very spleen and alcoholic dissipation against which it is rightly used as a remedy. The subtler poison treating the cruder. In fact, a subtler poisoning is a sign of progress in crude peoples. It is a step towards spiritualization. The English crudeness and peasant-like seriousness is most tolerably disguised, or better, explained and reinterpreted by Christian gestures, prayers, and psalm singing. And for that herd of drunken and dissipated cows who in the past learned to grunt morally under the influence of Methodism and again more recently as a Salvation Army, for them a penitential spasm just might be the highest level of humanity that they can attain. That much you can't allow. But what is offensive in even the most humane Englishman is his lack of music. Speaking metaphorically, and without metaphors, there is no dance or timing in the movement of his soul and his body. Not even a desire for dance or timing, for music. Just listen to him speak. Just watch the most beautiful English women walk. No other country on earth has more beautiful doves or swans. Finally, listen to them sing. But I am asking too much. There are truths best known by mediocre minds. They are best suited to mediocre minds. They are truths that have a charm and seductive allure only for mediocre spirits. We are coming up against this perhaps unpleasant proposition right now. Since the spirit of unworthy but mediocre Englishmen, I mean Darwin, John Stuart Mill, and Herbert Spencer, is starting to come to prominence in the middle regions of European taste. In fact, who would doubt the utility of having spirits like these prevail for the time being? It would be a mistake to think that far-flying spirits of the highest type would be particularly adept at detecting, collecting, and drawing conclusions from lots of common little facts. Rather, being exceptions, they are not well situated with respect to the rule. Ultimately, they have more to do than just know. They have to be something new, mean something new, and present new values. The chasm between knowing something and being able to do it is perhaps even greater and more uncanny than it is generally thought to be. People who can do things in the grand style, the creators, might need to be ignorant. On the other hand, when it comes to scientific discoveries of a Darwinian type, a certain narrowness, aridity, and diligent, painstaking care. In short, something English is not a bad thing to have at your disposal. Finally, let us not forget that the English have caused a total depression of the European spirit once already, with their profound ordinariness. What people call modern ideas, or 18th century ideas, or even French ideas, in other words, what the German spirit rebelled against in profound disgust, was English in origin. There is no doubt about it. The French were just the apes and actors, as well as the best soldiers of these ideas. And unfortunately, their first and most thorough victims too, since the âme française ended up so sparse and emaciated from the damned Anglomania of modern ideas that people these days look back at its 16th and 17th centuries, its profound impassioned strength, and its inventive nobility, with something bordering on disbelief. But we have to hold on to this statement of historical fairness with our teeth and defend it against the moment and appearances. The European noblesse of feeling, of taste, of manner, in short, taking the word in all its higher senses, is France's work and invention. European baseness, the plebeianism of modern ideas, is England's. France is still the seat of the most spiritual and sophisticated culture in Europe today, and the preeminent school of taste. But you have to know how to find this France of taste. People belonging to it keep themselves well hidden. There might only be a small number of people in which it loves and lives. People who might not have the sturdiest legs to stand on. Some of them fatalists, somber and ill. Some of them pampered and over the top. People who have the ambition to hide themselves. There's something they all have in common. They shut their ears to the raging stupidity and the noisy jabbering of the democratic bourgeoisie. In fact, it is a coarsened and stultified France that thrashes around in the foreground these days. It recently celebrated a real orgy of bad taste combined with self-admiration at Victor Hugo's funeral. They have something else in common too. The goodwill to ward off spiritual Germanization, and an even better inability to do it. Perhaps Schopenhauer is more at home and settled now in this France of the spirit, which is also a France of pessimism, than he ever was in Germany. Not to mention Heinrich Heine, who has been in the flesh and blood of the subtler and more promising lyrics of poets of Paris for a while now. Or Hegel, who, in the form of Taine, which is to say, in the form of the foremost living historian, exerts an almost tyrannical influence these days. But as far as Wagner goes, the more French music learns to develop according to the real needs of the âme moderne, and the more Wagnerized it becomes. This can be predicted. It is already happening now. Nevertheless, there are three things that, even today, the French can proudly exhibit as their air and their own, and an enduring mark of an old cultural superiority over Europe. In spite of any voluntary or involuntary Germanization or vulgarization of taste, one is the capacity for artistic passions and devotion to form, for which the phrase "l'art pour l'art," along with 1,000 others, was invented. Things like this have not been absent from France for the last 300 years, and thanks to a reference for small numbers, keep making possible a type of literary chamber music that is not to be found anywhere else in Europe. The second point on which France can base a claim to superiority over Europe is its old, diverse culture of moralism, which means that even among little romanciers of newspapers and chance boulevardiers de Paris, you will find, on average, a psychological sensitivity and curiosity that people in Germany, for instance, have no concept of, much less the thing itself. For this, the Germans would need a few hundred years of moralism, which, as I have said, France had not spared itself. Anyone calling the Germans naive on this account is dressing up a deficiency as a compliment. As a contrast to the German inexperience and innocence in Voluptate Psychologica, which is not at all unrelated to the tedium of German company, and as the most successful expression of a genuinely French curiosity and inventiveness in this realm of delicate tremblings, we can name Henri Beyle, this remarkable anticipatory forerunner ran with a Napoleonic tempo through his Europe, through several centuries of the European soul, as a pathfinder and a discoverer of this soul. It took 2 generations to somehow catch up with him, to guess some of the riddles that tormented and delighted him. This strange Epicurean and question mark of a man who was France's last great psychologist. There is, in addition, a third claim to superiority. At the core of the French, there is a half-successful synthesis of North and South, which lets them conceive many things and do many others that will never occur to an Englishman, using a temperament that is turned periodically towards and away from the South, and whose provincial and Ligurian blood bubbles over from time to time. The French fortified themselves against the awful northern gray on gray the sunless concept, ghostliness, and anemia, our German disease of the taste, against whose excess people at the moment are strongly resolved to prescribe blood and iron. I mean great politics, following a dangerous medical practice that teaches me to wait and wait, but not so far to hope. And in France, there is still a predisposition to understand and accommodate those rarer and rarely satisfied people who are too far-ranging to find satisfaction in any fatherlandishness, and know how to love the South in the North and the North in the South, the born Mediterraneans, the good Europeans. It was for them that Bizet made music, this last genius to have seen a new beauty and seduction, who discovered a piece of the southernness of music. I recommend taking a number of precautions against German music. Suppose that someone loves the South like I do, as an immense school for convalescence of both the most spiritual and the most sensual kind, as an unbridled, sun-drenched, sun-transfiguration that spreads across a high-handed, self-assured existence. Such a person will learn to be somewhat careful with German music, because, along with ruining his taste, it will ruin his health again too. If someone like this, who is Southern not by descent but by belief, dreams about the future of music, he will also have to dream about music being redeemed from the North, and have the prelude to a more profound and powerful, perhaps more evil and mysterious music in his ears. A supra-German music that does not fade, yellow, or pale at the sight of the voluptuous blue sea, or the luminous Mediterranean sky, which is what happens with all German music. A supra-European music that still stands its ground, whose soul is related to the palm tree, and that knows how to wander and to be at home among huge, beautiful, lonely beasts of prey. I could imagine a music whose rarest magic consisted in no longer knowing anything of good and evil, although, perhaps, some sailor's homesickness, some golden shadow and delicate weakness might run across it every now and then. An art that would see colors flying towards it from a sitting moral world, a distant world that had become almost incomprehensible, and would be hospitable and profound enough to receive such late refugees. Thanks to the pathological manner in which nationalist nonsense has alienated and continues to alienate the peoples of Europe from each other. Thanks as well to the short-sighted and swift-handed politicians who have risen to the top with the help of this nonsense and have no idea of the extent to which the politics of dissolution that they practice can be only entr'acte politics. Thanks to all this, and to some things that are strictly unmentionable today, the most unambiguous signs declaring that Europe wants to be one are either overlooked or willfully and mendaciously reinterpreted. The mysterious labor in the souls of all that the more profound and far-ranging people of this century the mysterious labor in the souls of all the more profound and far-ranging people of this century has actually been focused on preparing the path to this new synthesis and on experimentally anticipating the Europeans of the future. Only in their foregrounds or in hours of weakness like old age were they fatherlanders. They only became patriots when they were resting from themselves. I am thinking about people like Napoleon, Goethe, Beethoven, Stendhal, Heinrich Heine, Schopenhauer. And do not blame me for including Richard Wagner as well. We should not let his own self-misunderstanding lead us astray. Geniuses of his type do not often have the right to understand themselves, although, admittedly, it is not so apparent given the rude clamor of which Wagner is resisted and opposed in France today. It nonetheless remains the case that late French Romanticism of the 40s and Wagner belong most closely and intimately together. They are related, fundamentally related, in all the heights and depths of their needs. It is the soul of Europe, the one Europe, that presses and yearns upwards and outwards through their multiple and tumultuous art. Towards what? Towards a new light, a new sun? But who could really express something that all these masters of new means of language did not know how to express clearly? What is certain is that the same storm and stress tormented them, that they searched in the same way. These last great seekers, they were all dominated by literature up to their eyes and ears. The first artists with an education in world literature. For the most part, they were themselves writers, poets, go-betweens, and mixers of the arts and the senses. As a musician, Wagner belongs among the painters, as a poet, among musicians, as an artist in general, among actors. They were all fanatics of expression at any cost. I emphasize Delacroix, Wagner's next of kin. All of them great discoverers in the realm of the sublime as well as the repugnant and repulsive. Even greater discoverers in effects, in showmanship, in the art of window displays. They were all talents far above their genius. Virtuosos through and through, and with uncanny access to everything tempting, seductive, compelling, and subversive. Born enemies of logic and straight lines. Longing for the foreign, the exotic, the monstrous, the crooked, the self-contradictory. As humans, Tantaluses of the will, plebeians on the rise who knew that they were incapable of a noble tempo, a lento, in their life or work. Just consider Balzac, for instance. Unconstrained workers, almost destroying themselves with work. Antinomians and agitators when it came to customs. Ambitious and insatiable, without equilibrium or enjoyment. And in the end, they all crumbled and sank down in front of the Christian cross, and with complete justification. Which one of them would have been profound and original enough for a philosophy of the Antichrist? On the whole, an adventurously daring, splendidly violent, high-flying, high-ascending type of higher men who first taught their century, and it is the century of the masses. The concept, higher man. Let Wagner's German friends decide whether this is something purely German about Wagner's art, or whether it is not distinguished precisely by its derivation from supra-German sources and drives. The extent to which Paris in particular was indispensable for the cultivation of Wagner's type should not be underestimated. The profundity of his instincts called him to Paris at the decisive moment. Nor should the extent to which his whole manner and self-apostolate required the model of the French socialists. Perhaps closer comparison will reveal, to the credit of Wagner's German nature, that he did everything in a stronger, bolder, harder, and higher way than a Frenchman of the 19th century could do, thanks to the fact that we Germans are still closer to barbarianism than the French are. The strangest thing that Wagner created might even be inaccessible, incomprehensible, and inimitable to the entire late Latinate race, forever and not just for now. The future of Siegfried, that very free man, who may in fact be far too free, too hard, too cheerful, too healthy, too anti-Catholic for the taste of old and worn-out cultures. He might even have been a sin against romanticism, this anti-romantic Siegfried, although Wagner thoroughly atoned for the sin in his sad old age, when anticipating a taste that has since become political, he began preaching, if not traveling, the way to Rome, with a religious vehemence peculiar to himself, so that you do not misunderstand these final words of mine. I want to use a few strong rhymes, and then even less subtle ears will guess what I want, what I have against the final Wagner and his Parsifal music. Is this still German? It's from a German heart, this murky howling. From German flesh, this self-aimed disemboweling. It's German, then, this type of priestly feel, this incense-scented, sensuous appeal, this broken, falling, swaggered, swaying, this unassured sing-song saying, this nun-eyed, ave-chiming leavening, this falsely raptured heaven over heavening. Is this still German? Just think, you're standing there, the doorway's near. It's Rome, Rome's faith without the text. You hear? That's the end of part 8 of Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche.